I'm Richard Faragher. I'm President of the Knox Environment Society and have been for the last 10 years, so that probably takes us back to 2012. And of course this year we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Knox Environment Society, which started way back in 1982 when Doug Weston and Andrew Paget met to form the Knox Environment Society over concerns of our disappearing local environment. And the early days obviously saw us become established and grow from there. So I'll let Beth Batt continue that story now.
Greetings folks, it's Irene Batt here, Secretary of the Knox Environment Society, and I'm here to have a little chat with my mother Beth Batt, who's a long-time member of the organisation and a life member of the KES. So Beth, can you start off by telling us when you joined the organisation and what were the circumstances and reasons behind that?
Well, the Society was formed in 1982 and I think it must have been around about 1984 when I joined. I may have read the weekly column on environmental matters in the local newspaper, which Doug Weston, a founder of the Society, was writing at that time. My introduction to wildflowers came from my mother, who would take us, we would walk from Surrey Hills, where we lived, to Wattle Park, and picking the wildflowers on the way, which happened in those days. I became secretary, treasurer, but my husband Bill joined later and he was treasurer and he became a great mentor to the society.
So of course the KS, once they began, I mean, we attract volunteers, and attracting volunteers is always an interesting time, and many people volunteer for a whole range of different reasons. So I'll let two former presidents, Mick and Vree and Darren Wallace, tell you a little bit more about why they became involved.
So where did it all start for me with the KES? Well, I was an electrician and I'd been an electrician for about 10 years, and I was starting to get a little bit sick of it and felt that I needed a bit of a career change. So I thought, before I get a career change, the career I wanted was to be a ranger. And so I thought, well, I haven't got enough experience, I need to do some voluntary work. So what I thought I'd do is I'd rock on down to the Knox Environment Society nursery. Little nursery right down the back of Ferntree Gully Secondary College there. The college at the time was nice enough to, I suppose, share the land with the community. And I went down there and thought, what a beautiful place. What a place where they grow these magnificent indigenous plants. I want to get involved in this, so straight away I pretty much joined up.
I believe I joined the Knox Environment Society, Anne, in about 1990, and I particularly joined because I wanted to have access to some of the local indigenous plants that were being grown. I was interested in revegetating a scout park in Roeville at the time, and it's the only place I could find around that had indigenous plants. That scout park is Heaney Park. It still exists today. There's a scout group that now operates out of there. It's council owned, and it was one of my first experiences of using local indigenous plants in Knox or further afield in revegetation, because at the time it was deemed to be the appropriate thing to do, and in many times it still is the appropriate thing to do. But yeah, the Knox Environment Society Community Nursery was a particularly valuable resource 40 years ago, or not quite 40 because it wasn't in existence 40 years ago, probably about 35 years ago it's been in existence, but similarly valuable today.
One of our longest serving members has been Irene Kelly. Evidently she joined back in 1997, so I've been told, but since then she's just been a legend of the KES and one of the nicest and friendliest people I've ever met, and just a wonderful asset for the KES. So I'll let her now tell you a little bit more about her time at the KES.
I joined KES in 1997, which makes that about 25 years that I've been, a member of KES, and probably been on the committee for a good proportion of that time. I was drawn to the organisation, and particularly the nursery, because where we're sitting out in the garden now with these very tall trees, once they started to grow up after about 20 years, I looked around and all the grass had disappeared, and I just had this dry landscape, and was really concerned about what I could plant here to sort of take the place of the grass. And subsequently I found KES, and I was really glad that I did. About the same time that I became a volunteer at KES Nursery, because I just loved going up there and the plants that I was using, I also went off to TAFE to learn more about how to garden, and did a subject called Plant Growth in the Environment and Plant Adaptations. And all of a sudden, the two threads came together. And for someone who had been planting wandering trad as a nice ground cover for a shady spot, I suddenly realised the error of my ways and quickly removed it. Fortunately, people will be surprised to know it hadn't really taken around the sideway, but it was some years before I completely eradicated it, even though it wasn't a very big patch. Yeah, so I was really hooked on going up to the nursery and became very passionate about actually advocating Indigenous plants to a wider community.
KES was founded by two young men, Andrew Paget and Doug Weston. Andrew wished to vegetate an area, part of his acquiring a master's degree at Melbourne Uni, as I remember it. And I think that the site at Ferntree Gully High School was used for this purpose. Well, I believe he was extremely influential. He produced a book which he illustrated of the Indigenous plants of Knox, and that would have been the first ever an introduction to the public of that. KES has a copy, an important piece of work as an introduction to for KES to build on in the nursery. Doug had previously formed an environment society in the Ivanhoe area, and he was keen to do the same in Knox. I also remember a young couple living in Baronia who had their entire front garden filled with grasses as a reference for customers to the nursery.
Like a demonstration
Exactly,
garden.
yes.
Very
Yeah.
good.
At the time, I recall Andrew Paget was involved, and in fact he was the one that had really put the society on the map with respect to the nursery that was operating out of the Ferntree Gully Tech School at the time. I guess he might have been on the committee, he might have been the vice president. Certainly at some point in time he went on to be the president for a short time, but he was really the mover and shaker with the community nursery of the day. Well, my interest stems from a natural interest in horticulture and subsequently doing a horticultural apprenticeship. But as I mentioned earlier, through being involved in the Scout Park in Roval and wanting to do some revegetation there and not really knowing what to plant back there, because there wasn't much information around at the time. It should be remembered that the Knox Environment Society Community Nursery was one of the first community nurseries to exist probably in Australia. Certainly locally it was the first one, and that information that could be gained from that community nursery was invaluable for me at the time determining what species to use. I didn't know much, if anything, about natural vegetation communities in Knox or Melbourne. There was no Flora of Melbourne book around in the day back then, so I relied heavily on Andrew Paget, who was the nursery convener, and I took a lot of information from him and a lot of advice, and that was the beginning of a journey, I suppose, for myself in terms of Indigenous vegetation. Other people that I recall were Rachel Griffiths. She was from Rowville. I remember a fellow by the name of Chris Rowlands, and that was fairly early on in the piece. In the years to follow, there was a succession of individuals that I encountered just through my casual visits to the nursery, really, and it was quite a few years later that I got involved with the committee. Well, look, I definitely look back very fondly, having known Beth and Bill Batt. Beth's still with us. Bill passed away many years ago, but they were great mentors for me on the committee, and I guess at the time, probably my first introduction to the committee, Beth might have been secretary, and Beth was secretary and Bill was the treasurer. And they ran a pretty good organisation, a pretty good community group, and I'd like to think that I learnt a lot from them. Mick van der Vreede was an important contributor to the society, even in the early days. I can't exactly recall what the makeup of the committee was when I was first on it, but whatever the case, as is normal with community groups and committees, it's usually an eclectic mix of people from different backgrounds, from different parts of Knox geographically, and all with different interests. But certainly the Batts were really important people to me in my involvement with the society.
When I actually joined the committee, the people that were on the committee at the time were Mick van der Vreede, and who was president, and his wife Rosie was on the committee, and then people like Beth Batt was secretary, and her husband Bill was the treasurer. And the legacy that these people left for the rest of us is great. And of course we've now got Adrian, who continues on with the Batt legacy, so it's fantastic. And of course the nursery was set up all that time ago by that original group of people, Andrew Paget. So Doug Weston was around with Andrew Paget, and Andrew Paget was the driving force to set up the actual nursery. And I'm always so incredibly grateful that they did have that vision. And I understand Andrew was particularly doing it for some university project. But imagine if we had to set up a facility like that. Even when I joined, it wouldn't have happened because the expense and the land and the vision to do it would be so difficult. So I'm always grateful that someone like me could come into an organisation like that and virtually have that fantastic infrastructure to be a part of. So very grateful for that.
So Beth, what do you remember about the early days of KES?
Well, initially there were 2 meetings a month. One was a committee meeting, and the other was a general meeting where a speaker was invited. Objectives, aims and objectives of KES were not arrived at till quite some time later. Well, the meetings were held in the private homes of committee members, and there wasn't a wide membership in those days. It was very casual in the early days. When I was secretary, Bill and I put out the Kestrel Newsletter, a single photocopied sheet. He would be tapping away at our portable typewriter, and he'd call out, "Help! I've got a space, give me something," and I would scramble through the limited correspondence that I had and find a quote. Or I did have a book of origins of botanical names, and that certainly came in handy.
And we were living in Boronia, and we had 5/8 of an acre up on Stewart Street.
Bill and I became involved in Kes work at Old Joe's Creek, which was adjacent to where we were living, and the society, and working in the nursery, and it was a very important part of our lives. Yes.
But when I joined, I found that the nursery was struggling a bit. A few people had left, and so I suppose a few people that saw that I was quite keen and interested put the acid on me a little bit, or the hard word, and said, you know, you'd be good. You know, why don't you give it a go? Why don't you actually become the nursery coordinator? What did I say? I don't know anything about plants. You'll learn. No worries. So I decided to join the committee and take on the role of running the nursery, which I just knew nothing about. But because it was such a magnificent little place, everybody was so warm and interesting, and I was like a sponge with my brain because it was something new that I was just so passionate about. I learned pretty quick. And then interesting people like Darren Wallace turned up, and others who had more knowledge and more information to share. Before too long, I actually felt like I actually knew something about Indigenous plants. So that's sort of where it all started for me in terms of running the nursery. And of course, that was a fairly hard task because it meant managing volunteers. It meant trying to organise some orders, larger orders. It meant trying to improve the look of the nursery, and it took a bit of time to sort of gain those experiences and get to a point where the nursery was running pretty smoothly and people were pretty happy with it. Not long after that, the president at the time, I think his name was Chris Rouse, he said that he was going to chuck it in because he had some personal things to deal with and other things in life to go on with. So Chris came to me and sort of said, I think you'd be a good president. I said, really? I'm not a person who likes to talk in front of people or whatever. He goes, no, you'd be fine, you're fine. So I thought, yeah, why not? This is a group where it's got a nice base being the nursery, where a little bit of money's being made. That money can be used to do things, to buy things, to lobby the council and other levels of government. It's a great opportunity. So I thought, why not? So I jumped in as president, and I reckon I was the president for probably something around about 13, 14 years. Ran the nursery for a little bit longer. In fact, when I first started at the KS, it was probably something like 35 years ago, so people can do the sums on that. It's 2022 now, so work that out. So it's been a pretty long sort of history, and I've really enjoyed it.
After serving a significant apprenticeship as Vice President, yes, I did. I was asked to take on the role of President for a period in excess of a decade, I believe. And this was done as a consequence of the former President, Mick Vreede, being elected to Council. And having served that apprenticeship for 5 years, I thought it was time to step up, and during that time some very exciting things in fact happened. The Society continued to lobby all levels of government on a whole range of issues, from climate change, renewable energy, improved public transport locally, biodiversity protection, and very excitingly during that period the organisation got the opportunity to move from the first and only nursery location at the rear of Ferntree Gully Tech, or secondary college as it became, without any tenure at all, to the current site, a new site with security and tenure, which was fostered by the Knox City Council of the day and the committee of the day. So that was a particularly important action that occurred during that time.
Subsequent to being on the committee for a period of time, I became Vice President, and I found that the role that I could take on as Vice President was to advocate and celebrate Indigenous plants and how they performed. And so that's where I took up the mantle of going and delivering talks, which is quite surprising, and it does show you that being a volunteer does develop you personally, because I've always been, well, I'd say pretty shy person, and not really, would never have seen myself as someone who could do that, but that will show you how really passionate I became about how it was important. I felt that if someone like me, hearing the value of these things, could learn, that all we needed to do was share these messages with a broader community, and I still believe that.
I believe that the area was first partitioned off. A teacher at the school encouraged children to grow vegetables. In fact, there were vegetables still there while it was being used as a nursery. There was a small pond which was later filled in, and I was told that neighbouring children used to hop over the fence to look for yabbies. We also purchased a do-it-yourself shed, which was somehow put together to make the very small shed was used for propagating. At one time, at a recess time, school children set fire to the grasses which spread adjacent to the nursery, and a fire attacked a tree and part of the shed. But other times we had problems with a very boggy ground. We had to reform the entrance to the nursery, and there were many times where cars were pulled out of the boggy ground.
Yeah, well, when I joined the actual nursery, it was really bare bones. It did have a lovely established garden area, but very basic facilities, more or less what you might describe as an undercover humpy or shed. And our sole, if you like, valuables, which was our cash box and our floor of Melbourne, would get zipped up at the end of our shift and taken to the milk bar across the road for them to manage, ready to be picked up the following Sunday, because in those days we were only open on a Sunday. And it always amuses me to think that that was the sole treasures that we had, was the cash box and the floor of Melbourne, and everything was really open slather. So we had nothing, but we did have the volunteer base, which has always been the treasure, I think, of Kes. And we would have this wonderful clientele that would come in and want to know. But we were tucked down in those days behind the high school in Ferntree Gully High School as it was then, and is now the special school on Dorset Road. So we were quite difficult to find, but people did make an effort to find them. A funny story of those older days and my complete novice approach at the nursery is that one year when we reopened after the Christmas break, I was on duty with Louise Harris, who is a life member, a very young life member, because of her commitment for such an extended period to Kes. And like me, she has a great love for the place, and she's our roster person even to this day. Even though she doesn't live in Knox, she lives in, up in the hills. Now, Louise and I are on duty. All the boxes of plants are laid out on the ground as they are at our current nursery. No signage at all. And we rock up about 10 minutes before our shift, and she hasn't got a clue, and neither have I. We were told that the signage had been put back in the order that they were taken up. And so it should be just easy to go along and reapply the signage to the boxes of plants. But of course, meanwhile, other plants have been added to open up, and we don't recognise anything because we're so novices. And what happens? But the customers roll in, because this is our first day that we're open. Oh my God, and they want us to tell them what the plants are. No. Anyway. saviour, Richard Faragher, who I didn't know was Richard Faragher then. Every question we were asked and we were unable to answer, this other client at the nursery, this other visitor, who I now know loves his quiet Sunday morning reflecting and doing his own thing, is trying to have some peace and quiet, but can't resist answering the questions for us. And that was my first meeting with Richard Faragher. And of course, his knowledge that he displayed that day meant that eventually I was to mention him in dispatches at committee meetings as someone that might likely like to go on the committee. And as we now know, is our president, and very able president, and he has much more knowledge of the plants than what Louise or I did.
Thanks, Irene, for all that information. That was wonderful. I moved into the area back in '87, and soon after that started buying plants from our old nursery behind the high school. And then a few years after that, I became a volunteer and started working at the nursery, selling on a Sunday. And then soon after that, or probably a few years after that, they suckered me into joining the committee. And that was a terrific experience. I really enjoyed that. And then finally in about 2012, Darren Wallace had finished his tenure as president, and luckily I got that role and have been president ever since. Yeah, the block that we bought had Indigenous plants on it. It's a fair bit of a bush block. It borders Blind Creek, where Blind Creek comes out of the National Park. Unfortunately, Blind Creek there is a very deep gully and is full of weeds, and for the last 30 years or so I've been fighting the weed infestation, but obviously a lot of plants from here have gone in to my garden, and you know, there's still some remnant plants there as well. And we've bought the block next door, and there's a branch of KES there as well. We have a poly house on my block, and we have some of the rarer plants, ferns and stuff at my place. And the block that I've got is completely planted out with a lot of plants, rarer plants from here, and so we source a lot of cuttings and seed from around my place as well as local sources. So I really enjoy that. I've got quite a few mature eucalypts, and it's just a wonderful place to be. Birds, we have a swamp wallaby who lives at our place. We have echidnas, cockatoos, but lots of small birds, which I really enjoy. But I just wish I could make the creek a cleaner environment.
Well, my first recollection of campaigns was the preservation of bushland reserves. There were photocopied leaflets with Andrew's excellent illustrations and a Melways reference for each reserve, and on occasions they had to be fought for from the bulldozers, and advising council on mowing regimes. And I'm very delighted to see that Knox Council is now promoting some of these very small reserves in its current booklet on parks in Knox.
Yeah.
We had, there was revegetation on several sites, mainly along creeks, and of course a very major project was the swordgrass brown butterfly. 6 sites in Baronia and the Basin were revegetated. At these sites, swordgrass brown butterflies had been observed, and Doug had a swordgrass brown costume. I'm sure that he also spoke to local school children in his costume.
In the costume, yeah. So examples of those sites would have been Old Joe's Creek.
Yes.
And Wicks Reserve.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Batterham Reserve, and the school at the Basin and
Yep.
yes, so those areas. Also, there were Kes was instrumental in Knox Council hiring its first environmental officer, but there was a very big emphasis on these reserves, and it's good to see that has borne.
Continued and developed.
But yes, yes.
I've got really great memories of working with Darren Wallace in the early days before I became a local councillor, lobbying the council for improvements in the way the council dealt with the environment, the sort of funding that it applied to the environment, and they're pretty much their processes and procedures, trying to lock in the environment and sustainability into their policies rather than have a little on-the-side add-in. And so I remember a number of years ago, Darren and I were talking about the structure of the council and how the way it was put together, particularly in terms of bushland management, didn't do a lot for having a real focus on bushland management. So we chatted about it, and I said, oh, hang on, I'll grab a piece of paper. So I grabbed a piece of paper and I drew a block flow diagram of what we both thought would be a really good structure for that council to have in order to properly address sustainability and biodiversity issues. Anyway, Darren booked a meeting with the Mayor and the CEO. We rocked on down there with our little bits of paper with our little block flow diagram on it, and we had a bit of a chat, and we told them how concerned we were and how we've got some ideas for them. And the Mayor at the time grabbed the bits of paper off me and said, do you mind if I go and photocopy these? She went away and photocopied them and came back, and I think it was probably, I can't remember, but it was 3 or 4 months later, there'd been a change structure in council which was very similar to our block flow diagram. Wasn't exactly the same, but they'd actually created a Department of Sustainability or something like that at the time. There was never one of those before. There was just a Parks and Gardens area, and the Bushland crew was moved from the Parks and Gardens area where there was really no focus on bushland. It was mainly parks and footy ovals and things like that. And it was moved in under the Sustainability Department. And so the people above them were all pro, let's do something about sustainability and biodiversity management. And so the guys down in the Bushland crew had good leadership. That's a great story because it's like, who were we? We walked in the door with a few pieces of paper and said, this is what we think. We walked in there with the right approach. We didn't walk in there whinging and saying, we want you to fix it. We walked in there saying, we're concerned, here's a solution. And I think it just showed how good the Knox Environment Society were at that time in doing that, because there was a lot of other instances to do with public transport and other issues that are based around our environment as well, where we were quite influential and created change in council, helped to create new positions, which then helped us as a KES to get more things done because there was dedicated people in council, focused on those sorts of things. So very, very, that was a story that I like. It's a story I like to tell because it just goes to show how grassroots activism, if it's done in the right way, in a positive way, can actually make a change.
Along the way, I was, when I was on the committee, Jan Jordan, the lady who originated Gardens for Wildlife, came to the committee seeking support. And because of all the way that I had learnt about the Indigenous plants and the important role they played, and also at the same time, again, how threads come together, I was volunteering at the zoo as a guide, and as you would take people around, invariably the wildlife, the faunal wildlife that was under threat or endangered or whatever, it was always one of the key things was lack of habitat. And so again, this thread comes together. And when Jan came to the committee and presented the idea for Gardens for Wildlife, I knew it was its time. I knew it was absolutely its time. And I worked with Jan. to take that to council. What a formidable person she was. And going back to the fact that I'm saying how shy, unassuming that I was, I don't think I would have had the gumption to persevere with Gardens for Wildlife if it hadn't been for Jan. Because the very first meeting that we turned up to spruik our idea to council, we were told in no uncertain terms by James Rose, who was standing in for the new biodiversity officer that had been appointed but just hadn't yet arrived, which was to be Nadine Gaskell. But at this time, James Rose was was sitting in the spot, but he was out in the field, and we turned up for our meeting that Jan assured me she'd organised with James, and that we were going to talk Gardens for Wildlife. And they had to call him in from the field, and he was a bit cross when he got there, because he said to her, first words he said to her, "I didn't have any meeting organised with you." And her response, Jan's response was, "Well, now you're here, you may as well." And I think I would have just said, "Oh, sorry," and gone home, because I would have been, "Oh my God, what's happened?" Jan just goes, "No," she says, "Well, while you're here, you may as well listen to us and have a meeting with us." And I was just, "Oh." And fortunately, James is a big man, a big person. He was so polite, again a gentleman, he was so polite to these ladies and did meet with us, and in fact listened to us and agreed that it was a really good idea. The willingness of these people on council to embrace such a novel idea, and interestingly now the success of our program, you know, it started in 2005, so here we are all these years later. Not only has it won peer awards within the local government area, a very significant award for environmental program, but it's been rolled out across many LGAs. I think about 30 LGAs are very, very interested in various stages of development, and there are many councils that have actually taken the project on. And what's more, not just taken it on because they could adopt any model they like to run it, they're actually running our model. So it's testament, and we should be very proud at CARES that we partner Knox Council in it and support it, and that it's one of our members, and our preparedness to work with Council in this partnership that has seen this project roll out across the state.
So could you tell us a bit about how CES has changed over the years?
Well, I certainly believe that the relationship between CES and the Knox Council has improved. But then again, 40 years ago, we were all ignorant, including the Knox councillors to some extent, on environmental matters.
Sure.
And I hope the council has certainly grown into a better partnership with CES these days.
I was really fortunate during those very early times to, as I said, work on things like the sales. I loved that. A little bit of propagation in those early days, but mainly going up and selling the plants. And through that I met people like Ray Cowling. And Ray Cowling and I worked for probably years and years and years until he gave up nursery duty every Sunday morning. I always did the first Sunday of the month and still do. And it was interesting because Ray, if people would know him, absolutely lovely, he's somebody I refer to as a gentleman, a complete gentleman, but not very talkative. We would do our chat for the first 5 minutes, and from then on it was head down and get on with it for the rest of the time. But it was really, I treasure that time and value working with him for that extended period. In the early days of course volunteering on the sales, I was privileged to work with some really great people like Ray Cowling and of course yourself, Anne. You know, we go back all that time to when we used to work in that humpy and on the old site, don't we? And all the chats that we had and whatnot, and it's great to see that you've come back to Kes when you've got more time, and of course Kes is very like that. That people, I don't think, ever leave. They just go away for a little while and then they return to do some jobs. So it's great that we've got that connection with people. And other roles that I've taken on through the nursery have been representing Kes at the festivals, so Knox Festival and Stringy Bark Festival, and had some wonderful people that have consistently come along and turned up and worked on the rosters and helped me put the festival's exhibits together. But importantly, were there sort of supporting and helping me, you know, man the tables. Roger and Jill Lockwood was someone you could rely on every festival. Melissa Allen, she's been there from a very young girl, maybe 16, 17, 18, I'm not sure, all the way through now she's Vice President of the organisation. So, and people that would turn up just at the end of every festival, someone like Bernie Hoffer that really didn't volunteer as such at the nursery, but would just turn out of the blue when it was pack up time and help you pack it up and do the physical work. It's those sorts of people, I think, the unseen volunteers at the nursery that really keep it ticking over. It's those unseen people, I think, that we may not mention their names now, but people like Bernie represent that just do the job because it needs doing. And during the time on that committee, Graeme Patterson joined, and again he's still very active like myself at the nursery and others. And what I love about Graeme is when we moved to the new site in about, I think 2008, 2009, to the new site at Wally Chew where we are now, Graeme Patterson built a lot of the infrastructure that we actually valued and used. In fact, I would say to people when I was showing them around the nursery that it was very like the TARDIS from Doctor Who. It looked very like there wasn't much on the outside, but when you actually looked, you know, that seed room tucked around the back was just a magic solution. And Graeme built all that, and here he is now part of the team that's pulling that down and replacing it. And I think that's such a generous response as a volunteer, you know, rather than being precious about what they valued and built, but moving to, you know, actually renew and go and set it up for the future. So the team that's doing that, Peter Chamberlain and Trevor, you know, good on them. At the behind this organisation that's growing and selling plants, there's this wide or broad range of skills and generous donation from people of their time and their vision. And of course I've met Ellen and Faye Rimmer, John Exon, other people that I've worked with during my time on the various facets and working in the sales team. It's been really great. I really enjoy it. And at the present time I'm working with a lass Gail. I work every first Sunday of the month with her. And then there's another lass that came in, Anne Emsley. She comes in and cleans all the labels at the nursery. And she's been a long-term member who's done sales, but just behind the scenes, she's making sure that all that ticks over. And though I don't want to single individuals out necessarily, I think they are representative of those people. And of course, there's the Luke Selick, who, again, like Richard, was someone that came into the nursery and I'd see him when we were on duty. And I mentioned him in dispatches at a committee meeting, and he ended up on the committee. Such a valued member of the committee. He took on the Rare and Threatened Plants project and got the Caring for country grant and fulfilled all the obligations under that 20,000 grant that saw that rare and threatened plant species project come into being. And out of that, it brought a new richness and to what we did at the nursery. The objective had always been to grow plants at the community Indigenous nursery that were affordable for residents to put back in their gardens. That's one of our prime objectives of our nursery. Of course, to support the bushland, you know, to build that network, that connection. But this rare and threatened plants project meant that we were propagating those plants that would then enrich the actual bushland and return them to where they needed to go. Some that were very, very low in numbers. And that attracted a whole new group of people and groups to the nursery, and we're the better for it today. We've got the hunters and gatherers that go out on a Saturday morning collecting the seeds and cutting material. And of course we've got the seedy ladies that are there doing all the sorting, cataloguing, cleaning, and they love seedy men, but they're mainly seedy ladies, but they assure me they do love seedy men, and occasionally they get a man to join them and they're welcome. But these are groups that have sprung up out of the work that Luke did, and of course his sister Jo Selick is very keen hunters and gatherer, and is also absolute stalwart, working within that planning area, holding developers to account. And of course, after Luke Selick went off the committee, we were so very fortunate to have someone step up like Erica Peters, who was prepared to take on the role of rare and threatened plants project. Because every year you have to apply for the permits, which is quite a significant thing to do and it requires such a lot of work. So again, someone to celebrate that they come out of their comfort zone, which we all have to do if we want this organisation to move forward. Graeme Patterson, for many, many years, not only was our building aficionado, but took on the role of treasurer. And when he stood down to have a bit of a break from it, we were really scratching our heads and trying to decide how we could find another treasurer. And at a meeting subsequently, when we're looking at this great hole that's been left by not having a treasurer, we had a visitor that night and who'd come along to see how the committee worked. And people said, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? No treasurer, we need to get a treasurer. So we'll have to start to think about how we can fill that position. And the young lady that had come along to have a look at the committee said, I could do that. I'm doing bookkeeping and accounts. I think I could do that. And that's Kirsty that we now have as our treasurer. And I'm just so amazed how that happens so many times when you throw out into the air that you need something, but this fantastic broad sweep that our volunteer base is made up of, there's someone that will put their hand up and say, I could do that. Another aspect of CARES that I think is really very valuable too is of course our Kestrel Newsletter, and along the way we've had a lot of people who've invested their time into producing that once a month, and it's a great place to have our roster. So we've got people that like Bill and Beth that took it on and were doing it when I came on board, and of course there was Luke Selick did it for a period, extended period, and Louise Harris again, our roster clerk, she did the Kestrel as well. We've got Natalie, who's still a member of the Hags team, but did the Kestrel for an extended period, and then Alice took it on. Although it wasn't something that she really wanted, she did an absolutely sterling job. And then to our present day, when we're looking for someone, once Alice decided that she'd had enough and wanted to concentrate on her seed cataloguing, which is another very valuable job, and we had Annalee, who was really generous and is doing a very good job of the representing the Kestrel once a month.
Yeah, so Irene mentioned a lot of people who have been long-term helpers here, and we really rely on those people because obviously they get to know the running of everything, and you can rely on them to do a wonderful job. We're attracting a lot of really good volunteers recently, but a lot of that involves us teaching them all the procedures, and that's time consuming. Probably there's a few names that Irene missed that I'd like to mention. So we have Jamin Walker, who is a propagator here, and early days setting up here at Furniture Gully. He was wonderful, all his knowledge, all the work that he did to set everything up, educate our volunteers in propagation techniques. And then Colin Turner after that, really knowledgeable man, especially about orchids. Helped us a lot with our Banksia cuttings, getting the procedures right for that. And then Ian Morrish, who was our next main propagator. Again, very quiet, unassuming man, but his knowledge was really wonderful. And he helped find a number of plants that we haven't had before. So I'd like to thank those three gentlemen for all their really, really hard work at the KS, and yeah, they're always welcome here.
In Kes early days, the scope was narrower, the vision was more limited, but I'm delighted to see that that now it's developed into a very valuable, reputable organisation with its roots in the local soil, but expanding, spreading to a wider environment. Right from the beginning, there was a tension between probably the two main objectives of Andrew and Doug, who formed the society. On the one hand, wanting to produce a successful nursery, and on the other hand, wanting to deal with environmental problems and education, and there's often been the thought that this was too much for one organisation to deal with. We should either become a nursery only, or else become a society which dealt as an environment society with wider issues, or else we should split into two different groups. But I have been of the belief, I have no supporting data, that introducing people through the nursery and with the atmosphere at the nursery, the workers who are enthusiastic and helpful, this can lead and does lead to customers being involved with CARES campaign issues and a wish to work for a sustainable world. And I think CARES has been blessed with many good leaders who have guided us in this direction.
And I think there's plenty of anecdotal evidence for what you're saying.
I'm sure there is, yes.
But yeah, it's fundamentally often been about the plants, but you can't have the plants without the wildlife or the other elements to the ecosystem. And it should be noted that in the time that I first became interested in plants and recognised it was important to plant back the species that did occur, local indigenous species, for the benefit of flora and fauna, that things have changed. The climate is changing, so there is now some situations where what I did 35 years ago I might have done differently today. I just think it's important that we be adaptive to changes in climate and variations in weather patterns, because we need to be responsive to this. Otherwise, a lot of what we thought was the right thing to do may end up being in vain. The important role the Knox Environment Society played in fostering and developing other community groups and supporting other community organisations in that period sort of probably 20 years ago through to about 10 or 12 years ago, maybe even more recently, the Knox Environment Society played an important role in helping setting up at least one other local Indigenous community nursery, that is Candlebark Community Nursery. Many people won't know this, and from a business point of view, it's usually not a great idea to actually set up competition to you, but this is the big difference between community organisations, and in particular the Knox Environment Society. They may be a plant nursery, they may be, you know, a retail nursery, but it was, once again, it was probably more about the plants than anything else. So to set up someone that was doing the same is a great thing. The Knox Environment Society, over several decades, contributed literally hundreds of thousands of dollars to like-minded environmental groups, the Wilderness Society, ACF, local community friends groups would have been recipients of funds, money, maybe in-kind stock, plants, Public Transport Users Association. If there was a cause, an environmental cause of the day, the Knox Environment Society had the capacity to contribute to it through the revenue it generated from selling plants. And I always used to say to people, you know, what a terrific organisation to be involved with, something that both produces something good and then can pass the profits on or share in that profits with other organisations that have, you know, a similar cause, a like-minded cause, a desire to improve the world we live in. Certainly a far cry from being a mining company that, you know, or an oil extraction or a coal mining company that, you know, really the only people that benefit are its shareholders. It's a great organisation to be involved in, where you grow local Indigenous plants, the broader community and the environment benefits, and then some of the profit share gets distributed around.
I'd like to thank all the people who contributed to the making of the video, the speakers and the people behind the scenes. And I think one of the most important things you can get out of the 40 years is what a wonderful community the Knox Environment Society has been, and hopefully will continue to be, and the way that we support people in their passion and their interests. And also recently we've become an umbrella group for friends groups as well, and we're really trying to support them with plants and advice and so on. And we've also been supporters of the political side as well, with helping to support Save Lake Knox, Save Boronia Heights, the fight against the Hanson Quarry expansion. And I hope into the future that we can continue the wonderful work here at the nursery, which is a wonderful conduit for getting volunteers and obviously money, which is used we recycle into the community, but also to keep fighting these political fights that we need to fight, to keep the council thinking about the environment at all times, and to pressure governments of all persuasions to keep doing the right thing by the environment. So the best way we can do that is to keep our volunteers up. Obviously the more volunteers, the more members we have, then the more clout we've got, and the more work we can get done. So I just say thanks to everyone, thanks for the last 40 years, and we'll look forward to the next 40 years. Thank you all.
Any more questions?
Wow, that's nice. Yeah. A flyover. Is this something you organised for me? Especially.
I hope I don't think of anything else. No, let's pack up before I do.